liner President Cleveland heads into port, and on board is a happy little Korean orphan, 5-year-old Kim Koo-pil. He's got his passport, he's got a new home in America, and he's got new parents, too. Airman Bill Pond, veteran of the Korean fighting, and Bill's mother. Bill befriended the youngster on the field of battle, and now, after months of complications and delay, brings him home to peaceful America. Home is right from the heart.
It has been more than 20 years since the first large wave of transracial adoptions began to change the complexion of many families across the country. As these adopted children have come of age, they have become living case studies of the challenges, joys, and sometimes pitfalls that can come with adoption across racial lines.
I grew up in Kansas City, the Kansas City area, but spent a lot of my youth in a very rural community that was predominantly white, and I grew up without having any kind of sense of connection to Korea, being Korean American, or even just being a person of color.
I think about my experience growing up is that I have a very, very open, loving family, and that was just omnipresent in my experience growing up. And they were also very open about adoption. So I knew from the time I was very young that I was adopted. And developmentally, it takes some time to understand what that means.
I have 4 kids, 3 of whom are adopted, and were adopted transracially. So it's been a personal journey.
There are 1.5 million adopted children in the United States, over 2% of all U.S. children. Transracial adoption refers to children who are placed with an adoptive family of another race or ethnicity.
In a lot of ways, growing up adopted is growing up, like anybody else grows up. I think one of the big pieces is that, especially in a transracial adoption, is that you don't share the racial background as your family. And so when you're out in the world, when you start going to school and you're out interacting, in the school and in the community, you have experiences that are different from those of your other family members.
I couldn't really articulate a lot of the feelings I had growing up, and my way of coping was kind of to just ignore everything and pretend like there was nothing different about me, even though I knew there was, and other people knew there was something different too.
With my children, it's been a journey as well, because the reaction has not always been positive. I remember distinctly with my youngest son, all 3 of my kids were born in Baton Rouge, and with my youngest son, we were at his birth. And I remember being in Baton Rouge and being struck by the fact that there were black people and there were white people, but rarely did you ever see them together. And so we were in Baton Rouge with a snuggly, which nobody had anyway, so I think that was an oddity. And people would come up and say, "Oh, let me see the baby." And they would look at the baby, they would look at me, and they would turn around and walk off without a word.
Critics of transracial adoption have been speaking out as early as 1972, when the National Association of Black Social Workers famously produced a paper that opposed the adoption of black children by whites.
The National Association of Black Social Workers has taken a vehement stand against the placement of black children in white homes for any reason. We affirm the inviolable position of black children in black families where they belong physically, psychologically, and culturally, in order that they receive the total sense of themselves and develop a sound projection of their future.
There are those who insist that transracial adoption of children of color by white families is a form of cultural genocide, perpetrating the destruction of communities of color in the United States and abroad.
Racism is so strong in this country, and it's so institutionalized.
I identify as multiracial, African American, American Indian, and Caucasian. And I usually, though, when I talk about having a multiracial identity, also say I'm transracially adopted, because it's all together, usually.
I remember having moments when I was younger, when having sort of these realizations that I wasn't white. Because I think sometimes I would almost forget that I was Korean and then look in the mirror and be surprised.
people expect you to have this knowledge about your racial identity. So when you're adopted, you go out, you go out and learn about it. And I had sometimes felt like an imposter.
And I think the hardest thing for me was thinking about with my son having to explain racism to them and having to explain the fact that as a black man, people will assume certain things about him. And he is the sweetest, boy there is. And sorry. And having to explain that people will not like him because of the color of his skin. And that's really hard. And it makes me cry every time I talk about it because I just think, how can somebody not love my son?
In terms of what my parents did in my racial identity development when I was growing up, I think I grew up in Seattle on Capitol Hill, and we lived in a racially diverse neighborhood, which was important. My parents have friends from with different backgrounds.
I also don't think that it's fair to for instance, raise a child of color in a community that is all white. Because I know a lot of kids, even who have black parents who live on the east side, who their entire life have been one or two of the black kids in the school, and they get to middle school and beg their parents to send them to school in Seattle because they don't want to be the only black kid.
And so I think it's really important for parents to try to make connections with people and communities of color who live here in the States. And they may or may not be first generation. I think it's important for young adoptees to know adult adoptees, so who can validate their experience in a way that their parents would probably like to, but can't in the same way.
If your child's going to be the only person of color in that school, like, what about moving to a community where you're the only white parents that are coming to PTA meetings?
People need to be aware that in adopting a child of a different race, that requires you to be prepared to do some things in your life that you may not normally do. You need to be able to provide culturally appropriate mentors, friends, experiences for your child, and that means more than just some cultural event once a month. There are things that you need to be prepared to integrate into your life and integrate into your child's life.
I'll have adoptive parents who have young kids now say to me like, oh, things are really different than when you were growing up, and that's true, that things are very different, and but at the same time it doesn't mean that they're not going to have their own struggles.
One of the things about adoption is that child's story starts with the adoption process. So when a family is thinking about adopting and they're contacting the agency and they're doing this work, like that's the beginning of the story for that child. And when the child comes to that home, that's when their life starts with that family.
I mean, at some point they're going to realize that they don't look like you, and unless you've kind of built in things around that and a discussion around that can be really hard.
I don't really know any transracial adoptees that ever had a moment where they recall sitting down with their parents and their parents saying, guess what? Or we have something to tell you, you're adopted. Because it's always something I remember knowing.
So I think that while love and stability is the core, I think that there is a duty to provide beyond that. And I think it's false to believe that you don't need to provide those things for your children.
United States citizens started adopting children from other countries in substantial numbers after World War II. Many of the children adopted were European and Japanese war orphans. Additional adoptions followed after the Civil War in Greece, the Korean War, and the war in Vietnam. Statistics in the past 2 decades also underscore the growing popularity of white parents adopting children of color. The 2000 census, for example, revealed that more than 16,000 white households included adopted black children. The number of multicultural families has grown in the last decade, and Americans adopted more than 200,000 children from overseas during that time.